So she was the first one to get to the sepulcher, to the grave, and see that he was gone. But he said not to touch him, for he has not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say, I ascend. So he's about to ascend to the Father, right? Now, again, if he was in a flesh and blood body, hey, the Father is in the third heaven. He wouldn't even be able to make that trip. But at this point, he hadn't yet gone. Now let's skip down. Go ahead, keep reading.
Verse 19. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst, and said unto them, Peace be unto you. And when he had so said, he showed unto them his hands and his side.
Okay, so now it said this the same day. It said that the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled, and Jesus came and stood in the midst and said, Peace unto them. So again, he's doing things the normal person can't do in a flesh and blood body, because it's pointing out that the doors were shut for a reason. He just popped up in the midst of them and said, Peace be unto you. Now it said, and when he had said so, he showed them his hands and his side. Go ahead.
Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord. Then said Jesus to them, Again, peace be unto you. As my Father has sent me, even so send I you.
Okay, now let's skip down to, pick it up at 24.
But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe.
So Thomas ain't believe what the disciples told him. He said he wanted, put his hand through the wounds of Jesus, the print of the nails, for him to believe. Go ahead.
And after 8 days again, his disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you.
So again, it's pointing out the doors were shut, and he just popped up. But now what does he tell Thomas here?
Then said he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. And be not faithless, but believing.
Okay, so now he tells Thomas he can handle him, he could touch him. But he told Mary at first, Touch me not, for I'm not yet ascended. But now he had already ascended to the Father and came back. And we're going to show that, because when we picked it up in Luke 24, we didn't read all of it, but read it at your own leisure. The disciples said that it was 3 days later. They said it's 3 days later. And when we read further down in that chapter, he told the disciples to handle me in Luke 24. That was still 3 days later. Now we picking it up here. He's dealing with Thomas over a week later. But hold on. If you can't hold that thought, we're going to go to Leviticus 23. Because really, I should have read this first. You know what I'm saying? And kind of. Yeah, the disciples said, besides all this, this is the third day since these things happened. Even though it was the first day of the week. We read that. It was the first day of the week, which is Sunday. So now let's go over to Luke. Nah, that's Luke 23. 24, I'm sorry. Or when Mary first got there, first day of the week, and he wasn't there, then she talked to him, and then he said, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended. Then later that day, he appeared to the disciples, but we didn't see him tell him to handle him there. But he had to appear before the Father that same day. We don't see him tell Thomas there, because now when we go to Luke, it says 3 days later, and he told him to handle me. He said, For I have not flesh and bones he said, For a spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see me have. He said, Handle me. That was the same day in Luke 24. So the point is that he had ascended to the Father on that same day and come back. But they didn't see him he didn't tell Thomas to handle him until 8 days later. But we're going to prove all that, because again, like it says, the holy days are a shadow of things to come. You know, they all are pointing at what Christ had to come and do. And they're going to explain exactly why he had to go be waved before the Father on that day when we deal with this first fruits. Because Christ, it calls him the first fruits, right? The first begotten of the dead, right? And it's for a reason, because all of this stuff was teaching us about what he was going to do. So we back in Leviticus 23. And we're going to pick it up at verse 1. Leviticus 23 and 1. And when you're ready, take off.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, Concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts.
Okay, so he about to give them the feast, and it's the Lord talking to Moses. But let's skip down. We're going to skip past the weekly Sabbath and get into the holy days. Verse 4. The annual holy days. Go ahead.
These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons.
All right, so check out the first one. He said, in their seasons, because these come once a year, and they got to come in their season. You know, Passover's going to come in the springtime. It ain't going, you know, because some people, the way that they keeping it, eventually, they could be keeping it in the middle of winter, you know, or in a totally different season. But he said, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. Go ahead.
In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover.
Okay, so the 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Passover. Go ahead.
And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord.
Okay, now these are the first feast on the Lord's calendar, first annual feast for the new year. Passover, then the next day, unleavened bread. But now we're going to skip down to verse 10 and go ahead.
Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye be come into the land...
Now, does he give them a date for this one? Did we read any date? Let's see. He said, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye be come into the land. So he don't give them a date. First one he gave them was Passover, unleavened bread. Now he says, when you come into the land, do what?
Which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof. Then ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest.
Oh, so now when they come into the land and they reap the harvest thereof. So whenever the harvest is ready, they're going to bring a sheaf or a fistful of the harvest, and they're going to give it to the priest. Go ahead.
And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord.
All right, so pay attention. He's going to wave this fistful of the first fruits before the Lord. For what?
To be accepted for you.
To be accepted for you. When does he do this?
On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it.
On the morrow or the next day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. All right, so now he gives them the Passover, which is the day that Christ dies on. Christ says he's going to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, we know in Matthew 12 and like verses 38 through like 40. He said he's going to be in the ground 3 days and 3 nights. And we know from the scriptures, you know, we just read that they got there on the first day of the week in Luke, and we read it in John, and that's when they discovered his body was missing. That's the morrow after the Sabbath. We know he was cut off in the midst of the week, even though that's referring to, you know, to years. We know he literally died on a Wednesday. And we could count Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and he would have rose on Sabbath, Saturday. We could count Thursday as the first day, Friday as the second day, Saturday as the third day, and he would have rose before the end of the Sabbath. And that would have made the 3 days and 3 nights. He literally died on Wednesday and rose before the Sabbath was over. So they get there on the first day of the week, and this is what was supposed to be happening. He said, when ye be coming to the land which I give unto you, because this is the next feast after Passover. He don't give them a date for this one. But he only gave them so far Passover and unleavened bread. He said Passover 14th, he gives them a date. 14th day of the first month. Next day, 15th day, starts unleavened bread. Then he says, when you come into the land and you reap the harvest thereof, you're going to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord. This is what Jesus meant when he said, touch me not, for I have not yet ascended, to my Father. But even keep reading. He said, he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. Skip down to verse 14.
And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto your God.
So they couldn't touch the rest of their crops. They couldn't eat nothing until they gave the first fruits, this fistful, to the priest. They couldn't touch nothing else. He said, and you shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto your God. Go ahead.
It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings.
All right, now let's go over to 1 Corinthians 15. Because again, all of these, the whole Bible, Christ said, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me to do thy will. So let's go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And let's pick it up at verse 20. Let's pick it up at verse 20.
But now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept.
Okay, so it said Christ is risen from the dead, and become the what?
And become the first fruits of them that slept.
So that was all pointing at Christ. It's not calling him the first fruits for no reason. And this is why he had to ascend on that day. He had to be waved before the Father. This was for the rest of what was, even if we go back to the holy days, we'll see that they had to have another offering, which was like really the second half of first fruits, if you will. That's what becomes Pentecost. They start to count on the day that he waved the sheaf before the priest. That's when they start to count. And then Pentecost comes 7 Sabbaths later, 50 days later, on the morrow after the Sabbath. And then they had another offering, without going into all of that. But this is how we know that he ascended to the Father that day. And that's why when we read it in Luke 24, we'll go back there again. Huh? You know what? I don't think it is live. The one I got says that the stream ended.
Did you try to go back?
Oh, okay. Yeah, we live. I was in the old one. All right. So, and we're going to read, I'm going to read verse 23 here in 1 Corinthians 15 too. I got it. So it says, I'm going to read it at 22. This is 1 Corinthians 15 and 22. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. But every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ's at his coming. All right, so it said, again, it calls them the first fruits right here. But then we're going to find out if that's the end of the first fruits. Let's go over to James, the first chapter. So it said, now is Christ risen and become the first fruits, the first begotten from the dead. Let's pick it up at James 1. And verse 18. James, the first chapter, just one verse, verse 18.
Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures.
Okay, so now it called Christ the first fruits, and it clarified that he's the first begotten of the dead. But it says, of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Because we didn't really read the whole protocol of first fruits, but hey, 50 days after they start to count, they make another offering. They're going to bake it with leaven. The first offering they bake with just fine flour, no leaven, and that represented Christ, who died without sin, because we know leaven represents sin. But then 50 days later, they made a second confusing route to, like, I should have started in Leviticus 23. Should have started there.